Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Colorado Pilots Association webinar. We call this CPA Presents. My name is Mike Busch. I am the Flight Safety Chair for the Colorado Pilots Association. Our special guest tonight is Mr. Mike Busch. Mike is the founder and CEO of Savvy Aviation, located in Sheridan, Wyoming. He is a renowned aviation writer, teacher, aviation type club, tech rep, pilot, flight instructor, aircraft owner, advocate, and entrepreneur. He is arguably the best known A&P IA in general aviation, who literally wrote the book on how GA maintenance should be done. He has been assisting aircraft owners with their maintenance problems through his lectures, articles, and books. Mike writes the monthly Savvy Maintenance column in the AOPA Pilot magazine. In addition, he was honored by the FAA as the National Maintenance Technician of the Year in 2008. Tonight's topic is Just Say No to Useless Maintenance. Mike, I would like to thank you for accepting our invitation to speak to the aviation community. I will now turn it over to you.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Mike. Let me correct one minor nit in your introduction. Please don't come and visit me in Sheridan, Wyoming. As charming a place as Sheridan is, if you show up in Sheridan, Wyoming, you and you're really lucky, you will find a lawyer's office, but that's all you're going to find.
Oh,
I'm actually located. Savvy is a kind of a classic virtual company. We've got people located everywhere throughout the United States. I am actually located on the central coast of California, sort of roughly halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and sort of in God's country here on the, if you can find God's country in California. But since California is a notoriously business unfriendly state, and since Savvy Aviation is a virtual company that doesn't really have real estate anyplace, we chose to domesticate it in Wyoming. So, but anyway, don't come visit me in Wyoming because.
Okay.
Any rate, I'm delighted to be with you guys, and I'm glad I finally got my computer problem squared away. I wanted to talk to you about the owner's role in managing maintenance. The title of this presentation is Just Say No to Useless Maintenance. We'll actually be talking about quite a few things, but that's probably the most important theme. I've been sort of preaching this gospel for 3 decades or so. For many years, I went around the country teaching 17-hour, very intensive weekend seminars for aircraft owners on how to manage maintenance, and discovered that owners, even after they learned how to do it, a lot of them either didn't have the time to do it or didn't have the courage to do it. So about 15 years ago, I started Savvy Aviation to offer services where we would do it for aircraft owners who had a problem saying no to their mechanics. We don't have any problem saying no to mechanics. We're all mechanics ourselves. And since then, Savvy is diversified into a lot of different areas, and we provide a pretty broad palette of services to aircraft owners. But this has been something that I've been preaching for decades now. I've written 4 books on the subject, and I've done more than 150 webinars on various aspects of maintenance and the owner's role in maintenance. Let me kind of quickly cut to the chase and talk about the 5 biggest mistakes that I think aircraft owners make in dealing with the maintenance of their aircraft, and then we'll get into some real nuts and bolts stuff to illustrate this. But the 5 biggest mistakes, in my view, first of all, it's kind of the title of this talk, it's not saying no to unnecessary maintenance. And we'll be talking in lot of detail about what sort of maintenance that mechanics do to airplanes that you should consider unnecessary, and there's a lot of it. Most owner-flown airplanes are grotesquely over-maintained compared to what they need, and so one of my recurring themes is to try to get owners to cut back on how much preventive maintenance is done to their airplanes. The second big mistake is allowing work to be done on your airplane without your explicit authorization. A lot of owners kind of let mechanics make decisions on what maintenance to do. That's a very bad thing to do because mechanics have totally different motivations than aircraft owners do. So if you leave your decisions on what maintenance to do on your airplane to your mechanic, you're probably not going to be very happy with the result. You're specifically probably not going to be very happy with the invoice. The third big mistake is allowing work to be done without a written estimate, and it's just amazing to me how often that happens, where owners don't actually find out what the annual ordeal is going to cost until they get the invoice, and then there's this big sticker shock thing because they're not prepared for it. In normal life, we don't ever buy anything without knowing what's going to cost. We wouldn't buy a pair of shoes without knowing what it's going to cost. If we hire a contractor to paint our house, or an electrician to put some, a new sub panel in or something, we don't just sort of hand them a credit card until, say, call me when it's done. We ask them to prepare a proposal with a cost quote so that we know what we're dealing with. And sometimes we, ask several contractors to do competitive quotes. But it's amazing to me how much aircraft maintenance is done without any agreement up front as to what things are going to cost. And that's kind of a setup for shock on the part of owners, and for disagreements between owners and mechanics, fighting over the invoice. By the time you get the invoice, it's kind of too late to affect the outcome. You need to do that beforehand. And so we never want to allow work to be done without getting a formal written estimate for it first. And then if the ultimate invoice doesn't conform with the estimate within reasonable bounds, we have some basis to argue about it, but otherwise we don't. The fourth is, and we'll be talking about this quite a bit, is allowing work to be done just because it's due, just because the book says you're supposed to do it every, 2 years or 5 years or 1,000 hours or whatever the book says. That's a terrible reason to do maintenance, just because the book says you're supposed to do it. And we'll talk about why the books are written the way they are, but they're definitely not written in the aircraft owner's best interest. And if you do everything by the book, you wind up doing way more maintenance than the airplane needs. And the fifth mistake, which we probably won't really be getting into very much tonight, but it's allowing problems to be shotgun. And by that, I mean, you put your airplane in the shop with some specific squawk, something's not working right, the engine's running rough, or whatever the complaint is. And instead of doing proper troubleshooting, the mechanic just starts changing parts and hoping to get lucky. And that's not the way troubleshooting needs to be done. Troubleshooting needs to be done by testing things and by analyzing things, and by using tools like non-invasive tools like borescopes and multimeters and stuff. We don't want to be troubleshooting problems by changing out components, especially expensive components. So that's what we talk about, shotgunning. And one of the things I've found over the years is that as a general rule, GA mechanics are pretty good at the therapy part, at the wrench swinging part, but a lot of them aren't very good at troubleshooting. Now, that's not to say all mechanics are like that. There's some really excellent troubleshooters out there, but they're kind of few and far between. So if you have a problem and it's kind of got your mechanic stumped, and he's inclined to be, doing things like sending out magnetos and changing cylinders and stuff, don't let that go on. You need to get some troubleshooting expert to help you figure out what's wrong. And I spent a lot of my time helping both owners and mechanics who are stumped with situations, figuring out how to troubleshoot problems properly. But we won't get into much troubleshooting stuff because we got a lot of other stuff to talk about tonight. And most of what we're going to be talking about is saying no to unnecessary maintenance and figuring out what the right thing to say no to is and what things you shouldn't say no to, because that's the trick. And one of the things I've found over the years, and really the thing that motivated me to start Savvy Aviation 15 years ago, was that most owners are profoundly uncomfortable saying no to their A&P mechanics. Now, that's always seemed odd to me because most of the aircraft owners I know are, very successful people. Otherwise, they wouldn't be aircraft owners. They're typically professionals. They're entrepreneurs. They tend to be type A personalities that are kind of masters of their domain. And yet, when it comes to the maintenance of their aircraft, they kind of turn into sniveling wimps, and they let. Somebody's got an open microphone. Somebody is coughing into an open microphone. But at any rate, most aircraft owners that I've found, and this is the reason that I started the company after doing these seminars for years, is that I found that even when owners know what they should do, they have a hard time actually bringing themselves to do it. And I don't know, maybe those same people would have trouble saying no to their doctors. I don't have any problem saying no to my doctors. I do it all the time. But any rate, a lot of aircraft owners have a hard time saying no to their mechanics, and so sometimes we offer to help them say no when they're uncomfortable doing that. But we'd really rather that they learned how to say no, to be honest with you. So at any rate, I'm going to tell you a story. Not a story. It's a true story about a guy named Alan. And what he went through, because I think it really illustrates a lot of the points that I want to make about maintenance and about how owners should be dealing with maintenance. Anyway, Alan, who's a very successful businessman, wound up buying a brand spanking new Cirrus SR-22 back in 2003. And he flew the heck out of this airplane. He was based up in the Pacific Northwest, and he lived about an hour and a half flying time by Cirrus from where a lot of his work was done. So he would commute to work basically in this airplane, and he flew it a lot. Like I say, he was putting 250 to 300 hours a year on the airplane, which is unusual for a single owner flown airplane like this one. Most owners on average will put maybe 100 hours a year on their airplane. So he was flying it quite a lot. And after the warranty expired and he started paying for all of the maintenance himself, his annuals were typically costing $5,000 or $6,000 a year, the annual ordeal that he had to go through. And he was having the airplane maintained by a Cirrus authorized service center that was close to where he lived. So anyway, by 2003, the airplane is 7 years old. It accumulated almost 1,900 hours in that time. And in that year, in 2010, Alan decided to try a different Cirrus service center that he'd never used before. That this was a service center that was closer to his work location rather than his home location. and it was a service center we'd worked with before. And it was a very, very good service center. It really did excellent work. Very, very competent. Knew the aircraft extremely well. So he put his airplane in for its 2010 annual in this new to him service center that he hadn't used before, and it turned out to be a very eye-opening experience for Alan. And the thing that made it an eye-opening experience for Alan is that this new shop went over this airplane with a fine-tooth comb, as they were wont to do, and presented him with a discrepancy list containing 89 discrepancies, which is quite a bit. First annual on my Cessna 310 that was on my watch after I bought the airplane. This was before I was an A&P myself. That had almost 100 items on it, so I can really identify with what Alan was going through. But the repair estimate totaled nearly $25,000, and Alan was used to paying $5,000 or $6,000 for annuals, and so this $25,000 really blew him out of the water. This is what was on the final page of this work order that the shop sent him, about $12,000 in labor charges, and about the same in parts and some other minor charges. But at any rate, it was a very impressive number, very close to 25 grand. And he was not expecting that. And fortunately, the shop didn't present him with an invoice for $25,000. It presented him with an estimate for $25,000, and it was seeking his approval to proceed, which is the way the things ought to go. And unfortunately, doesn't go that way with a lot of shops. But this was a large and very professional organization, and they had their act together, and they had all of their stuff on computer. All of their work orders were managed by a very good computerized work order system. So they put together this estimate for Alan. Basically, at this point, all that they'd done is the inspection part of the inspection that they had flat rated for a little over $3,000 just for the inspection portion of the inspection, but came up with this repair estimate. Of course, Alan got it, kind of freaked out, and said, I've been taking this airplane into a service center every year, and I've been paying $5,000 or $6,000 a year, and now all of a sudden I've got a $25,000 estimate. What am I going to do? So at this point, he approached me and told me what had happened, and asked if we could help him. And I said, sure, well, we could try to help him out. So we asked him to send us this work order from the shop with this detailed estimate, which is, really step one is that he did get a series of written estimates from the shop as to exactly what they were proposing to do, and exactly what, or at least close to estimated what they were going to be spending to do it. And so we looked through the estimates, and I won't give you all 89, but I'll kind of give you the highlights here. So the inspection flat rate fee from the shop was $3,600, a little higher than what most shops charge, but this is kind of a high-end shop and extremely thorough, and I think he definitely got his money's worth out of this inspection. They did a very thorough job. And then they started listing discrepancies. Flex hose replacement was called for every 5 years. That was going to be $1,900. Seals on the fuel drain valves, 5-year item. Another 5-year item, gascolator seals. There's an aileron rudder shock cord, aileron rudder interconnect in the Cirrus SR-22 that's done by a shock cord, and that the book says it's supposed to be replaced every 5 years. Alternator number 1 is supposed to be overhauled or exchanged every 500 hours. Alternator number 2, which is a little backup alternator in the airplane, is a 1,700 hour item, and the airplane was over 1,700 hours at this point. The prop is supposed to be overhauled every 6 years or 1,800 hours, whichever comes first. even as much as Alan was flying, the 6 years came first, but he was actually over both the 6 years by a year and the 1,800 hours by a few hours. And so the prop overhaul was called for, and that was a $3,700 item. The magnetos, the airplane used Bendix magnetos, and Continental called for those magnetos to be overhauled every 4 years. Main battery, it was a 2-year item according to the manual. There's the airplane had a TKS anti-icing system on the wings, and there's a filter in that system that's sort of a lot of work to get out and replace. And the book calls for it to be replaced every 2 years. So that was on the list. Fuel nozzle cleaning, which was an annual item. There was some rubber, they call them boots, but they're really just little pieces of rubber that glue onto the prop blades and have ridges to direct the TKS fluid to de-ice the prop. And they were those boots were cracking, so that was written up. Some heat damage on the lower engine cowling. Wing root fairing caps were starting to disbond. Muffler flame cones were warped, and so they wanted to replace the mufflers for what, $2,200. And the ELT was still a 121.5 ELT, and they wanted to upgrade it to a 406 ELT for $1,750. There's some miscellaneous paint touch up in there for $1,600, and then there were 50 more squawks that I won't detail because they were all fairly small things, but they added up to $1,400. And if you add all of that stuff up, you come up with this $24,730 number that Alan was dealing with. So we took a look at this long work order with all of these estimates on it. And the first thing we observed was that a whole bunch of these items were things that there wasn't actually anything wrong with. That they were either written up because they were somehow due according to the book, or the ELT, obviously they were encouraged to upgrade ELTs to the 406 ELTs. And the paint was just a cosmetic item, so there wasn't really any airworthiness issues with most of these items. They were on the estimate because basically, for the most part, the book called for them to be on the estimate, and the vast majority of those were time-directed items. There were a lot of 5-year things that all came due, and the airplane was 7 years old. And then there were some other things that were annual or 2-year items and so on. But a whole bunch of things were due according to the book. Due is one of my least favorite words in aviation maintenance. It's a big red flag. But the way our service manuals are written up, they're just full of these items that are supposed to be done at some particular time, whether it's time in hours or time in calendar years or calendar months or whatever. But the items in the manual are overwhelmingly time directed. So we went over this estimate with Alan, and we recommended to him that he just say no to an awful lot of this work that was being proposed by the shop, or if he was not comfortable doing that, we volunteered to say no on his behalf, because we certainly don't have any problems saying no to mechanics. And we tried to educate Alan basically our philosophy of maintenance, which is that aircraft maintenance is not a good thing like exercise. It's a necessary evil like surgery. And like surgery, I mean, sometimes you need to do it, but you surely don't want to do it any more often than absolutely necessary. Slight divergence from the topic, but about 2 years ago, I was down at the hangar. I was actually in the process of replacing a turbocharger on one of the engines of my Cessna 310. And like an idiot, I tripped over an extension cord that was on the floor of this hangar. And I wound up damaging my the Achilles tendon on one ankle. It was went in for imaging, and it turned out was a 60% tear of the Achilles tendon. And it hurt like hell, and I was limping around. And so I went to my primary care physician, and she referred me to an orthopedic surgeon. And I went and saw the orthopedic surgeon, and he took a look at my imaging, and he said, "Oh, well, we're going to have to fix that." And he explained that it was a common procedure, but it was going to wind up with me in a cast in a equine position for something like 8 weeks. And I wouldn't be able to walk without one of those silly dolly things. I wasn't going to be able to drive a car and so on. And I said, well, I can't be incapacitated for 8 weeks. I just can't. I'm not in a position to do that. Surely there must be some less invasive procedure. He said, no. He said, that's what we have to do. So I left his office. I wasn't very happy. I immediately got on the National Institutes of Health website and started reading about Achilles tendon tears. You wouldn't believe how much is written on Achilles tendon tears in the literature, because apparently this is a major thing that puts high-priced athletes out of commission. And so there's been an immense amount of money spent on studying the subject of Achilles tendon tears. And after reading all of this stuff, I came to the conclusion that I was a perfect candidate for a non-surgical approach. So I went back to my primary care physician, and I told her what happened at the orthopedic surgeon's office. And I said, I don't want to do that. I said, I'd like you to give me a prescription for some physical therapy instead, and see what happens. And she said, I don't blame you. That's what I would have done in your place. And she gave me a prescription for physical therapy. And it was a very good decision, not to let the surgeon cut into me. But the surgeon was only offering me this one option. At any rate, my little dissertation on surgery and saying no to doctors, it's kind of a parallel to the maintenance situation. But at any rate, I didn't have any problem saying no to that orthopedic surgeon after he explained to me that was the only option that I had. And we have to have that same attitude with regard to maintenance, even if the mechanic says, here's what you have to do. That doesn't mean you have to do it. There's been a lot of very good scientific work done on aircraft maintenance that started back in World War II. And in my first book, Manifesto, I have one of the first chapters in the book is on something called the Waddington effect, which was a study that was done involving B-25 bombers back in the early 40s, and bombers that were being operated by the RAF. The study was done by a very distinguished scientist by the name of C.H. Waddington, who was not a maintenance guy. He was actually a biologist. But he was pulled into the war like a lot of British citizens, and he was assigned to help the RAF figure out how to optimize their maintenance, and did a lot of study of it like a good scientist would, and discovered that an awful lot of the preventive maintenance that was being done on these B-25s was actually doing positive harm to the reliability of the aircraft. And he and his team recommended that the RAF cut back drastically on the preventive maintenance that they were doing on these airplanes. And of course, the mechanics said, "Oh my God, if you do that, there's going to be aluminum coming out of the sky." And turned out that Waddington was right. That when the commanders wisely followed Waddington's advice instead of the mechanics' advice and cut back the preventive maintenance on these airplanes, their dispatch reliability went through the roof, more than doubled. This whole thing was rediscovered back at United Airlines in the 60s by a couple of scientists that were working for United, who did a big study. This is right when they were switching from prop planes to jets. And in the case of United, it was DC-8s. And the scientists at United studied how the maintenance was being done at United and recommended, again, that the preventive maintenance be cut back drastically from what Douglas was recommending. And United did that and had extremely beneficial results in terms of dispatch reliability of the aircraft. And nowadays, this is something that's called reliability center maintenance. And nowadays, it's what the airlines do universally. It's what the military does universally. And just about the last part of aviation that does it the old-fashioned way is piston GA. And one of my missions is to try to change that. But generally speaking, if you do maintenance by the book, you're going to do way more maintenance than the aircraft requires to be safe, reliable, and legal. And in fact, you're going to make it less reliable. And there's just a tremendous body of very, very good science that demonstrates that that's the case. And one of the reasons that that's the case is because if you look in the service manual for any of our airplanes, whether it's the Cirrus SR-22 or my Cessna 310 or the Cessna 182 I used to own, or Blanca Viking I used to own, the books are all full of these recommendations. They're actually stated as requirements, but legally they're just recommendations. That work be done based on a time-directed basis, that you're supposed to do these various maintenance tasks at certain times, whether they're hours in service or whether they're calendar times, instead of doing them on condition. In other words, when they're demonstrably necessary. And basically what reliability-centered maintenance discovered was that that's not the right way to do stuff. The problem with it is that it assumes that all airplanes are the same, and their maintenance needs are going to be the same. And the times that are in the book that were, put there by the manufacturers, by some aeronautical engineers at the manufacturers, there are times that have to work for all the airplanes in the fleet, including the worst case airplanes in the fleet. So all these times are calibrated to the worst case airplane in the fleet. And there probably are some airplanes out there that ought to have some of these things done as often as the manufacturers call for, but most of them don't. And assuming that, your airplane is not the worst case airplane. I mean, if the worst case airplane for piston GA is probably an airplane that's tied down outdoors in South Florida, where the corrosion capital of the United States, and doesn't fly very often. But if your airplane is based in a lower corrosion risk area, or is hangared, or flies regularly, you don't have anything close to the worst case airplane. And so you shouldn't be maintaining your airplane like the worst case airplane needs to be maintained. But if you do it by the book, you're basically maintaining the airplane based on the assumption that your airplane is the worst case airplane. So it's just not a good idea to do that. And the thing is that mechanics will almost always follow the service manual recommendations, unless you explicitly direct them not to, by saying no, and saying no in writing. Because mechanics their decisions are overwhelmingly driven by liability concerns, and they they don't want to get sued if something goes wrong. They don't want to wind up being in a deposition having to answer embarrassing questions about why they didn't follow the manual. So unless you let them off the hook by giving them written instructions saying, I don't want to do that, they're going to do things by the book in order to minimize their liability exposure. And then you're not going to be very happy with the outcome, both because it's going to cost a lot of money and because it's actually going to make the airplane less reliable. Now, almost every manufacturer specified instruction in the book that has to do with when maintenance should be done is not a recommendation. I mean, is a recommendation. It's not a requirement. We are not, as Part 91 operators, required to do maintenance when the manufacturer says it should be done. In fact, we're not required to ever do maintenance unless it demonstrably affects airworthiness. There are two kinds of information in maintenance manuals. There's when to information and there's how to information. How to talks about the methods, techniques, and practices is the words that are used in the regulations of how work is to be done. And with only a few exceptions, mechanics are required to follow the how-to recommendations in the manual. If the manual says that spark plugs need to be, torqued to 300 inch-pounds, then the mechanic is required to torque them to 300 inch-pounds and is required to use a torque wrench. And that's all written in the regulations. But there are no regulations that require mechanics to follow the when-to guidance in the manual. They just do that out of training and habit because they want to minimize their liability. The decision as to when to do maintenance or if to do maintenance is really lies solely with the aircraft owner, unless the aircraft owner just sort of abdicates his responsibility. Now, there are two exceptions to this rule that when to instructions in the manual are not required to be complied with. The two requirements are this: if you have an aircraft that was certified, say, after 1990, and it was certified under Part 23 instead of the older CAR3 regulations, the manual might possibly have a section called airworthiness limitations. The older legacy airplanes like the Cessna 310, I flew basically every airplane I've ever owned has been an airplane that was certified under the older CAR3 regulations, and the vast majority of the owner-flown fleet are CAR3 airplanes, and they never have airworthiness limitations because airworthiness limitations hadn't even been invented until Part 23 replaced CAR3. But for example, the Cirrus has an airworthiness limitation section that says, for example, that the parachute system, the parachute has to be repacked every 10 years, and the rocket that fires the parachute has to be changed every 10 years. And that's an airworthiness limitation, and that is a requirement. Anything that's in an airworthiness limitation section is a requirement. There are just a handful of airworthiness limitations for the Cirrus, and most of them center around things that have pyrotechnic elements to them. For some reason, the FAA always wants to have an airworthiness limitation for anything that explodes that's inside an airplane. The other exception is that anything that's mandated by airworthiness directive is a requirement because it didn't come from the manufacturer. Airworthiness directive comes from the FAA. We don't have to do what the manufacturer tells us, but we have to do what the FAA tells us. So anything that's mandated by AD, we have to do. And anything that's in an airworthiness limitation section, we have to do. Everything else is that the manufacturer says you have to do is merely a recommendation. It's not a requirement. And it's your job as an aircraft owner to say no to all the stuff that you don't want to do. Your mechanic's not going to say no for you. My colleague Paul New, who is a very good friend, he was the maintenance technician of the year in 2007, the year before I got that award. And one of Paul's favorite lines is, "It's not your mechanic's job to make your maintenance affordable. It's your job to make it affordable." And of course, the trick is knowing when to say no. So let's talk about things that you should consider saying no to, and then some things you should consider not saying no to. As I mentioned before, you should give very serious consideration to saying no to any time-based preventive maintenance recommendation in the manual that can be performed on condition instead. And the vast majority of time-based recommendations can be done on condition. Time-based means you do them based on a fixed timetable that the manufacturer establishes. And on condition means you do them on the basis of inspection, that you only do the maintenance when it's demonstrably necessary because something has deteriorated or something isn't working right. And time-based maintenance assumes that all airplanes are the same, which they obviously aren't. And on condition maintenance assumes that they're all different and says, your airplane is unique and you should only be doing this maintenance when your airplane starts talking to you. And that's a much more sensible way to do it. And that's one of the basic tenets of reliability centered maintenance, is that maintenance should always be done on condition if it is possible to do it on condition. Now, there are a few things that we can't do on condition. For example, we recommend having magnetos removed and disassembled for inspection, a 500-hour inspection every 500 hours. And the reason is because first of all, there's a lot of stuff inside magnetos that can fail. There's a lot of plastic stuff inside magnetos that has a history of going bad. But the other thing is that there's no good way of figuring out what's going on inside of a magneto without taking it apart. Unfortunately, it doesn't, you can't check the oil filter of a magneto because it doesn't have one. You can't stick a bore scope in a magneto because there's no place to put it. We really don't have any tools for assessing the condition of magnetos without taking them apart on a periodic basis. So we have to take them apart. But magnetos are the exception. If somebody told you that you ought to replace your tires, every 100 landings or something, I mean, that wouldn't pass the laugh test. Nobody would do that because, you can look at tires and see if they're in trouble or not. If there's plenty of tread and the sidewall isn't cracking, you keep them in service. And if they're flat spotted or the cord's showing through or the rubber looks like it's severely weather checked, then you change the tire. But everybody changes tires on condition. Nobody would change tires on a time basis. And yet the vast majority of preventive maintenance that we do on GA airplanes are like tires. They're not like magnetos. They can be done on condition, not on time. So any time that it's reasonable to do preventive maintenance on condition, it should always be done that way. And anything that has a TBO is a good candidate for this. Basically, I'm a total non-believer in the TBO concept. Again, it assumes that to say this engine has a 2,000-hour TBO assumes that all Lycoming IO360s or whatever the engine is are the same. And that's absurd to consider that a Lycoming engine that's based in Florida or in Tampa, say, is going to have the same useful life as one that's based in Tucson or one that that flies 300 hours a year like Alan's did would have the same useful life as one that flies 50 hours a year. All of that, I mean, that doesn't make any sense to have a one size fits all number that's good for all engines. Propellers are even worse. You know, for 50 years now, I have been an NTSB accident report junkie. I subscribe to a publication called the NTSB Reporter, and every month I get to read several dozen NTSB accident reports. In 50 years, I have yet to read one accident report involving a piston-powered general aviation airplane where the accident was caused by the propeller being too high time. It just doesn't happen. I've read an accident or two where the prop departed the airplane, but that wasn't the prop's fault. That was whoever torqued down the prop retention nuts' fault. But it just isn't a problem. So, you know, I haven't overhauled my props in more than 20 years now, and I'm not in any hurry to do that because there's nothing wrong with them. They work fine. I'm, you know, TBO is a classic example of the sort of thing that we should not be paying attention to. We want to maintain our engines and our propellers on condition, and we don't want to be tearing them apart unless there's some compelling reason to do that. And just because, you know, the Hobbs meter or the TAC has reached some magic number is not a compelling reason to do that. Another thing that we want to say no to is preventive maintenance intended to prevent acceptable failures. What's an acceptable failure? Because another of the big themes in reliability-centered maintenance is the analysis of failure modes and the consequences of those failure modes. And manufacturers don't seem to do a very good job of doing that when they write their manuals. If preventive maintenance by definition is designed to prevent failures from happening. Corrective maintenance is maintenance that we do after failures happen. But preventive maintenance, which is a huge part of the maintenance that we do, is designed to prevent failures from happening. So we need to think about how various components fail and what the consequences of those failures are. And if the failure is one that isn't going to inconvenience us inordinately, it's not going to make us fall out of the sky, it's not going to hurt or kill anybody, it's not going to leave us stranded somewhere we don't want to be, then we shouldn't be doing preventive maintenance to prevent that failure. We should be running the component to failure and then fixing it after it fails. And again, this is one of the things that you know, the airlines and the military are all do very, very well, is to identify those components that need preventive maintenance to prevent them from failing versus the components where run to failure is reasonable. I mean, just to give you sort of a trivial example, my number 2 comm radio is a run to failure item, obviously. I mean, if it fails, it's not going to do anything bad because I got two radios. And so it would be crazy to do preventive maintenance on it. And of course, nobody does preventive maintenance on their number 2 comm radio. But they do preventive maintenance on a lot of things that are similar. I mean, for example, my airplane has 2 vacuum pumps, and they're the big 400 series vacuum pumps because I have de-icing boots, and they're very expensive, and most shops don't keep them in stock because they're quite expensive. And the manufacturer wants those vacuum pumps to be retired every 500 hours. Well, you know, you think about that. What's the consequences of a vacuum pump failure? Well, the consequence of vacuum pump failure is 0 because the airplane's designed that the systems will all function properly on one vacuum pump. we have two for redundancy. So, you know, to me, the vacuum pumps in my airplane are, because I have two of them, are an obvious run to failure item. And just to add belts to suspenders, I carry a spare vacuum pump in my wing locker, and I carry the special trick wrench that's required to change them, so that if I want to change that vacuum pump out in Sheep Dip, Nebraska, I can do that. But it would be crazy to pull those vacuum pumps out of service every 500 hours. Well, on the Cirrus SR22, it's got a fully redundant dual bus electrical system, and it's got two alternators. So as far as I'm concerned, that you know, the Cirrus's recommendation that the number one alternator be overhauled every 500 hours is silly. First of all, an alternator failure is not catastrophic in a Cirrus because it's got a backup alternator. And second of all, turns out that those alternators have a very high infant mortality failure, that when you put a new alternator in the airplane, that there's a pretty good chance that it's not going to make it through its first 100 hours. If it made it through its first 100 hours, then you probably have a good one. But there's a lot of infant mortality failure. So we really don't want to be changing, you know, a reliable alternator for one of unknown reliability. So it's just not a good idea to do that. So again, we need to think about the various components of our airplanes, how they fail, and what the consequences of those failures are. And if the failures are acceptable, say because we have two of them, or we have a backup of some sort, or because it's an inessential item that isn't going to, you know, isn't going to cause us to get stuck somewhere or fall out of the sky, then we shouldn't be doing preventive maintenance on that item. We should just let it run to failure and replace it after it fails. And finally, we want to say no to overkill. One of the things that it's important for owners to understand is that there's this hierarchy of verbs that we use in maintenance that have very specific meanings. And I've sort of drawn them kind of as a pyramid here, with new at the top, rebuilt right below it, overhauled below that, and repaired, or the term of art is IRAN, inspected and repaired as necessary, at the bottom. And the trick is we always want to use the lowest word in the pyramid that we can. You know, a perfect example is I had a Belanca Viking, used to have a King KCS 55 HSI in it. To overhaul that KCS 55 HSI was something like $3,000. And the KCS 55 had a nasty habit that the little glide slope bugs that would come down when you're flying an ILS, or I guess nowadays it would come down when you're flying a GPS LPV approach, would get mechanically sticky, and the bugs wouldn't operate correctly, and this was a big problem. And so typically what would happen is you'd report that your KCS 55 glide slope bugs weren't working right, and the shop would send your instrument out for overhaul, and you'd wind up with a bill for $3,500. Whereas what you really wanted to do is send the instrument out for an IRAN and say, hey, the glide slope bugs aren't working. Everything else in this instrument is working fine. It's just the glide slope bugs are sticky. Please just fix the glide slope bugs. And then you get an invoice back for $500 instead of $3,500. Because you really didn't want the instrument overhauled. You just wanted this problem fixed in them. So we have to discipline ourselves to not be using a word higher in this pyramid than what we really want. The overhaul, what I call the O word, is one of the most overused and expensive words in maintenance. It just seems like, if you squawk that something isn't working, the dollars and donuts that the shop's going to send it off to be overhauled, and frequently that will be wildly more expensive than what was really necessary to resolve the problem. Rebuilt is even a more expensive word than overhaul, because rebuilt implies two things that overhaul doesn't. First of all, it implies that it's overhauled to new limits, but even more significantly, rebuilt, something can be rebuilt only by the original manufacturer, whereas anybody can overhaul something. But if you want to rebuild the component, it has to go back to the company that built it, and you can bet that that's going to be expensive. And then, of course, new is going to be the most expensive of all of these words. But the vast majority of the time, all we need is an IRAN. We need inspect and repair as necessary. If you ask a technician to repair something, you are giving him full discretion as to what needs to be done. If you instruct him to overhaul something, you're taking away all of his discretion, and he is required to follow every instruction in the overhaul manual, which includes replacing a whole long list of mandatory replacement parts that may not need to be replaced in your device, in your component, but are required to be replaced for him to call it an overhaul. So most of the time, you want to give the repair technician the discretion to do only what's necessary and then stop. And the way you do that is you tell them to do an IRAN. Same thing, is true of engines and so on. If your engine has turns out to have a camshaft that's coming apart, you don't want the engine overhauled, which is very expensive. You just want the cam replaced, which is moderately expensive, but it's a fraction of what an overhaul would cost, because there's nothing wrong with your cylinders and stuff like that. You don't have to do anything. Then you send the engine in for an IRAN. And you always have the option to convert an IRAN into an overhaul. If he takes it all apart, measures everything, and says, I found all sorts of other problems that you didn't know about, you always have the option of converting the IRAN into an overhaul, but it should probably always start as being an IRAN. But there are some things, so we've been talking about all these things you should consider saying no to, but there are some things that you should not say no to. The first thing is, you can't say no to things that are required by regulation, because if it's required by regulation, it's non-negotiable. Anything mandated by airworthiness directive, by an airworthiness limitations section of the maintenance manual, if you have such a thing, if you've got a new enough airplane that it has airworthiness limitations, required inspections. The annual inspection is not optional. And some of us, not many, but some of us are required to do 100-hour inspections. 100-hour inspections are triggered by one of two things. You either have to be carrying passengers for hire, or you need to be using the aircraft to give flight instruction for hire, where the operator of the aircraft is the one that's providing the instruction. So if your airplane's in a flying club and the club members hire a CFI to give them instruction in the flying club airplane, that airplane doesn't need to have 100-hour inspections. But if the flying club provided the instructor, then it would require 100-hour inspection. So most of us don't have to do that, but we all have to do annual inspections. There are the things that the regulations require us to do. Biennial altimeter, transponder, encoder certifications are required. ELT battery changes are required. So anything that where the when to, if you will, is written into the regulations, as opposed to coming from the manufacturer, that we have to do this. We don't have to do what the manufacturer tells us to do, but we do have to do what the FAA tells us to do. So if it's in the regs, we have to do it. That's non-negotiable. Another thing, you don't want to say no to genuine airworthiness items, things that are found during an annual that genuinely make the aircraft unsafe. Most owners wouldn't say no to that anyway, because they want the airplane to be safe. Items that make the aircraft non-compliant with type design. The IA in an annual inspection is required to make a formal regulatory airworthiness determination of the aircraft. Is it airworthy or is it not airworthy? And there are two components to being airworthy. First of all, the airplane has to be in condition for safe operation. That's kind of the subjective part of airworthiness. And it also has to be in compliance with its type design. So if the book says that your brake discs, that the minimum acceptable thickness of your brake discs is 0.384 inches, and the IA puts his micrometer on your brake disc and it's 0.381, so it's 0.003 of an inch below minimum, he can't sign off the annual on that, even though, you know, a 0.381 thick brake disc is you know, not significantly less safe than a 0.384, but the manufacturer has written a spec that says, in order to be compliant with type design, the brake disc has to have at least this thickness. If it doesn't have at least that thickness, then the aircraft by definition is unairworthy, and he can't sign off the annual as airworthy. So stuff like that, we can't say no to, even though we know in our hearts that that brake disc would be good for another 50 landings. It's not a discretionary thing because it's part of the type design. And finally, you know, sort of another version of what an airworthiness item is it's something that prevents your IA from signing off the annual as airworthy. And I have a red asterisk after that because unfortunately there are some IAs who'll write up a discrepancy list on an annual inspection and say that all of the discrepancies are airworthiness items. And of course, that's just nonsense. In my experience, it's a little hard to generalize, but it typically, you know, an annual like Allen's annual with 89 items, there may be 20% of those items are genuine airworthiness items that either make the airplane unsafe or are non-compliant with type design. So, you know, if you have an IA that does an annual inspection and says everything he found wrong is an airworthiness item, and you have to repair them all, otherwise you can't sign off the annual, you probably should have a good sit down with him, and you might want to consider finding another IA, because that's just not right. IAs should not be able to refuse to sign off an annual as airworthy unless they have a really good reason for doing that. And the two good reasons are the ones listed on the first two bullets on this slide, either things that genuinely make the airplane unsafe or things that make it clearly non-compliant with type design. Those are the only two reasons that an IA should have for not being willing to sign off an annual. So anyway, with all of that, let's go back to what happened to Allen's annual, his 24,700 whatever it was annual. We wound up working with Allen in his shop to bring the final invoice down to $8,000. We reduced about $17,000 off of the estimate. Now, $8,000 was still more than what Allen was used to paying, because he had typically been paying $5,000 or $6,000, but it was a lot closer to reasonable. And by the way, we weren't in any way upset with this shop. The shop's job is to do the most thorough inspection that they can and to write up everything they find wrong. It's not the shop's job to decide what to do and what not to do. It's the owner's job to decide that. So, you know, if Allen had left all of this to the discretion of the shop would have done this $25,000 worth of work on his airplane, and would have felt just fine about doing that, because they were doing exactly what the book said to do, which is what mechanics are trained to do. It's really not the shop's job to bring that 17,000 down, or the 25,000 down to 8,000. It's the owner's job to do that. And how did we knock $17,000 off? By saying no to a whole bunch of things. So let's talk about what we said no to. We said no to virtually all of the 5-year items. The 5-year flex hose inspections, those hoses are typically good for 10 or 15 years. The fuel drain valve seals and the gascolator seals, that's just pure stupidity to do that on time. You know, you change them when they start to leak, but you don't just change them on general principle at a particular time. That just doesn't make any sense. Same thing with the aileron rudder shock cord. You can inspect that. If it's not fraying or anything, just leave it be. We've already talked about the alternators, the primary and backup alternators in the Cirrus, and in our view should be run to failure items because it's a fully redundant electrical system. We have to take the electrical system seriously in a Cirrus because it's an all electric airplane. But it's because it's an all electric airplane. It's built with a fully redundant dual alternator, dual battery, dual bus electrical system, so that the failure of any one component is not going to cripple the aircraft. And therefore, those things ought to be treated as run to failure items because their failure is an acceptable failure. The prop overhaul, well, you know what I think about prop TBOs. They don't make much sense. And Alan's airplane flew a lot and it was hangared, and his prop should probably go 2 or 3 times that 6-year requirement, given the environment that his airplane is. That 6 years might have been suitable if the airplane was on a tie down in Tampa. But it wasn't, you know, it was under, you know, much less corrosion risk and stuff. So it just didn't make sense to be following that. 4-year overhaul of magnetos that Continental called for, that's again sheer stupidity, because there's nothing in magnetos that knows about calendar time. Magnetos wear with hours in service, not with calendar time. There's only one component in the magneto that knows anything about calendar time, and that's the condenser. And the condensers are usually good for 12 or 15 years, and then the electrolytic dielectric will dry out, and they'll start to. And even if the condenser fails, all it does is it allows the points to start pitting. So it's not something that would let you fall out of the sky. But to overhaul magnetos every 4 years is silly. In fact, there's never a reason to overhaul magnetos. What just happened there? Uh-oh. I hit something that I shouldn't have hit. I don't know why.
Just zoomed in on it.
Yeah, I don't know how I did that though. So how do I unzoom?
Click to the next slide or back one.
Yeah, I accidentally hit something, but I didn't mean to.
There you go.
Did that fix it?
Yep.
Okay, I guess it did. Good. Thank you. Now that's good troubleshooting. I like that. But at any rate, we do recommend having the magnetos disassembly inspected every 500 hours, because they're one of those exceptions where there's no good way of doing a condition maintenance without opening the magneto up and looking at all those plasticky things in there. But all we need to do is an IRAN every 500 hours. We certainly don't need to do an overhaul, and we certainly don't need to do it every 4 years. That makes no sense at all, because magnetos wear with hours, not with calendar time. Where this 4 hours came from, I have absolutely no idea, but it makes no sense. The batteries are interesting too, because Cirrus wants both batteries change every 2 years. Now, if you look at the battery manufacturer, the Cirrus batteries are Concord batteries, but both of the GA battery manufacturers, both Teledyne Gill and Concord, they don't recommend replacing batteries on time. They recommend doing an annual capacity check and replacing them on condition, replacing them when the battery capacity demonstrably degrades below 80%. And I actually would tend not to do the capacity check every year, like the battery manufacturer says to do, because the capacity checks are a little hard on the battery. So since we know these batteries literally always last for at least 3 years, and they often go considerably longer than that, I would probably start doing cap checks after the battery was 3 years old. But for sure, replacing them on a fixed number of years makes no sense. When there's a perfectly good condition monitoring approach, which is what the battery manufacturers themselves recommend. So we said, no, let's not replace the battery after 2 years. The TKS filter is another good one. The only stuff that passes through this TKS filter is perfectly clean TKS fluid. And it's a bear to wrestle that TKS filter out, and it's expensive to change. And we've never seen a TKS filter come out that wasn't spotlessly clean. So unless you have some reason to believe that somebody poured a Diet Coke into your TKS tank or something, it makes no sense at all to be pulling this TKS filter every 2 years. So we said no to that. Annual fuel nozzle cleaning, that's a terrible idea. We've got a lot of data that shows that fuel nozzle cleaning causes more problems than it solves. Fuel nozzles tend to stay quite clean all by themselves because they have a very effective solvent running through them all the time, keeping them clean. If by some chance the fuel nozzle starts to get clogged because some particulate matter got into the fuel system and got lodged in the fuel nozzle, you'll see it on the engine monitor. And if the engine monitor indicates that a cylinder has suddenly started running leaner than the others, then that's a good reason to clean that particular nozzle. But absent some indication on the engine monitor indicating a clogged fuel nozzle, it's a lot better to just leave them alone. And it certainly never makes sense to pull all of the nozzles and clean them all. It just doesn't work that way. And by the way, if particulate matter gets into the fuel system, pretty much the only way it can get into the fuel system is because some mechanic opened up the fuel system. Because the fuel goes through 3 levels of filtration to get to the nozzle. There's a thimble screen at the fuel tank pickup, then it goes through the gascolator, which is a finer screen, and then it goes through a very fine screen in the fuel control unit before it finally can get to the nozzle. So particulate matter from the tank is never going to get to the nozzle. The only way stuff is ever going to get to the nozzle is as a byproduct of maintenance that involved opening up the fuel system and allowed some contamination to get where it didn't belong. So we recommend definitely not doing fuel nozzle cleaning on a regular time directed basis. Doesn't make any sense. The TKS boot cracking, that was a kind of a questionable item, so we asked for a good photograph of it, and determined that the cracking was superficial and that those TKS boots were not in the process of coming off the propeller. And so we said that can be deferred until it gets to the point where somebody's worried that the de-ice boot might depart the blade in flight. The lower cowling heat damage, we looked at some photos, decided that it was bad enough that it really needed to be fixed. So we recommended that Alan say yes to that one, even though it wasn't cheap, but it seemed like something that needed to be done. The wing root fairing caps were indeed starting to despond, and since they sit out there in 200-mile-an-hour air, we didn't want them departing the premises, so we recommended that be done. Again, it wasn't not cheap, but it was something that needed doing. The muffler flame cones were warped. They hadn't gotten to the point where they were starting to break up yet. But if they do break up, they represent a safety issue because they can wind up clogging the exhaust. But we recommended, instead of replacing the mufflers the way the shop wanted to do, that the existing mufflers be sent out for repair, which would cost about half as much as replacing them. So that's what they wound up doing, is sending the existing mufflers out to Aerospace Welding for repair. Aerospace Welding is the company that made the mufflers in the first place, so they were very definitely qualified to repair them. Replacing the ELT with a 406 was a good idea, but this airplane had an ACK E01 121.5 ELT in it, and at that particular time in 2010, ACK had not quite released their 406 unit, the EO4. But when that thing was released, it was going to be a drop-in replacement that would be extremely inexpensive to replace, instead of the $1,700 replacement with a different brand with all different wiring and stuff. So we recommended that Alan hold off until the EO4 was available, and then put that one in, because it would reduce the cost significantly. And it wasn't required by regulation to upgrade to the 406. It was just like a good idea to do it. The miscellaneous paint touch-up, we asked Alan if that bothered him. He said it didn't bother me. So we said, well, then don't do it until it bothers you. So he said no to that. And most of the 50 additional small items, they were small, and we recommended to do that. So after all those recommendations were over, the invoice total came down from almost $25,000 to $8,000, and Alan was happy, and we were satisfied that he made some good decisions there. Now, I must say that Alan's was a bit of an extreme case. It is not common, in my experience, to cut a shop's repair bill by 2/3, but it's quite common to cut it by half. Pretty much anytime we go over a shop's estimate, we can cut 1/3 to a half out of it without compromising any kind of safety or doing anything that involves saying no to something required by regulation, or getting into a big fight with the IA. Usually the IAs mostly are okay with you saying no to them. If you say no to them, nicely, and you give them a good reason, they just want to be taken off the liability hook. So you got to say no to them in writing, and then if something goes wrong, they've got it in writing from you that they propose to do X, Y, and Z, and you said it's okay to do X, but I don't want you to do Y and Z. That kind of takes them off the liability hook, because at the end of the day, it's the owner's decision what maintenance to be done. The mechanic is under the regs. The mechanics are responsible for how maintenance is done, and owners are responsible for if and when maintenance is done. And somehow or other, that distinction seems to have gotten lost with a lot of owners, and they think somehow mechanics are responsible for deciding what maintenance needs to be done. But that's not the way the regulations are written, and that's not the way it's supposed to work. Owners are supposed to make the decisions. And of course, the only way owners can make good decisions is if the shop does the inspection and prepares a detailed written estimate the way Alan's shop did. And then the owner can go through that estimate and make an educated, informed decision as to what of those items he wants to authorize doing and what he doesn't. And again, there's a lot of science that shows that eliminating unnecessary preventive maintenance, and this is the Waddington effect and the stuff that was done at United and so on, results in aircraft that are actually safer and more reliable than the less preventive maintenance is done that isn't demonstrably necessary. the more reliable the aircraft winds up being. So guys, that's all I have prepared. I'd be glad to do some Q&A if you have time for it. I've got what is it? It's almost I've got about 30 minutes before I have to get on another Zoom call, but I'd be happy to do some.
We did have one question came in through chat.
Okay.
And it's actually, well, maybe it's a two-part question. The first part is, what's a reasonable markup for shop provided new parts? Expecting some variance by price, of course.
There isn't a real rule of thumb. There's one tradition is that shops used to traditionally charge list price for parts, and they typically could buy them at discount. That whole thing has changed a lot because owners now that we moved to the online world, owners can buy parts at the same price as shops can. Owners can get engines overhauled for the same price that shops can. One of the things, shops are entitled to a reasonable markup on their parts. Reasonable markup is typically on the order of 20% maybe, but on really expensive parts, it kind of doesn't make sense to do that. For example, if you are foolish enough to decide to go get an engine overhaul, and that engine overhaul is $50,000, it really doesn't make sense for the shop to make a 20% markup on a $50,000 overhaul when you can order that engine yourself and have it drop shipped to the shop. And frequently if you handle things right, you can wind up escaping sales tax on the engine. If the engine's coming from Alabama or something to wherever you are, you might not have to pay sales tax on it if you order it and have it drop shipped to your shop. And sales tax on a $50,000 engine overhaul is quite a large chunk of change. So we generally recommend for really expensive things like engines that the owner handle a transaction himself. But for kind of run-of-the-mill parts, having some markup on parts that isn't inordinate, on the order of 20% maybe or so, is something that is a reasonable thing for shops to do. Some components, the markup is just obscene. Aircraft batteries are one of those things. It's the difference between the list price on an aircraft battery and what you can buy it for on aircraft spruce or wherever is huge. And since batteries are something that owners are allowed to replace themselves, it's one of the preventive maintenance items that owners can do without getting a mechanic involved. That is probably a component like that where the markup is ridiculous is a reasonable candidate for an owner supplying himself. But generally speaking, a 20% markup on parts is not an unreasonable markup to expect from a shop.
And the second part of that question was, have shops reacted to airplane owners buying and providing new parts to avoid the shop markup? Sort of a bring your own parts.
Well, that's something that we're kind of the basic rule is don't ever surprise your mechanic. Don't just show up with a part and expect the mechanic to install it. That's kind of like bringing a steak to a restaurant and asking the chef to cook it. It's just what you really need to do is discuss this with the shop beforehand and say, look, I would it be okay if I furnished a Concord battery and you put it in, and different shops have different policies. Some shops welcome owner supplied parts because they feel that it limits the shop's liability and so on. And if there's a warranty issue, then it's up to the owner to deal with the warranty issue rather than the shop. And other shops aren't crazy about owner furnished parts. So you just need to discuss this with the shop before you purchase the part and bring it in. Or, the other thing is you could limit yourself to buying parts that you are allowed to install under your preventive maintenance authority, like batteries. But for engines, to on something that expensive to pay a shop's markup plus sales tax, which the shop's going to have to charge you if they buy it and then resell it to you, that's an obscene amount of money, and that I think is not a reasonable thing for a shop to do. And I think the owner is perfectly justified in saying, I'm ordering this engine, having it drop shipped to you. The shop's gonna make 40 man hours of labor doing the removal and install of the engine. So it's not like they're not getting paid for their work. But talk to the shop first. Don't surprise them. You never want to surprise your mechanics.
If anybody else has any questions, they're free to come off mute and ask.
Everybody's chicken. Well, I'll tell you what. If you think of any questions, you can feel free to email me, and I'll be glad to try to answer them. My email address is on the screen. Or if you'd like to have even more fun, I do a twice monthly podcast with my two colleagues, Paul New and Colleen Sterling, called Ask A&Ps. It's one of the AOPA podcasts, and it's basically a call-in show. So if you'd like to be part of that show, we would love to have you part of the show, because we wouldn't have a podcast without owners that were calling in with problems. The email your question to our producer Ian Twombly at podcasts@aopa.org, and he'll schedule you for next recording session. And we typically record the shows around the middle of each month, and then the editors do their magic to make it sound good.
I know I listen to them on a regular basis when I'm working on my airplane build right now, so it's usually running in the background.
Yeah, we have a great time doing it. And also, if you'd like to receive my monthly newsletter, the easiest way to get on the mailing list, if you're not on it already, is to text the word SAVVY, SAVVY, to 33777, and a little text bot will ask you for your name and email address, and it will add you to our newsletter mailing list.
Yeah, Mike, this is Mike Kaselniak. I do enjoy your articles under Savvy Maintenance there in the AOPA Pilot magazine, especially the one on your trip out to Oshkosh this fall. That was interesting. Kudos to the gentleman, the two gentlemen that helped you out there. That was very interesting article.
By the way, the punchline that wasn't in the article, but the guy who actually installed it came in early Saturday morning to install the new tire and tube on my airplane and get us on our way on time. We hired him. He's now a Savvy account manager.
Oh, wow. Excellent.
Yeah, he's a fabulous guy.
No, great articles that you have in there. I remember one that you did maybe back in the spring, maybe it was last year, about torquing bolts. That was very interesting.
Oh, yeah, I did a pair of articles. One was called Tense Bolts, that was about threaded fasteners that were loaded in tension, and then I did another one the next month on joints that are loaded in shear.
No, those were very eye-opening ones. Very interesting. My background has been some military components where we did use helical inserts and such, and torquing them down. And after I read your article, I was like, "Wow, that is really interesting." Those are things that I had never even heard of before.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Not too many A&Ps really understand exactly what they're doing when they torque down a fastener. They kind of pull out the torque wrench and turn it until it clicks, but they don't really think about what they're doing is actually stretching the fastener and creating a specified preload. And the most important part is that they don't really understand the effects of friction on that whole process.
Yep.
So
no, that was very eye-opening. I appreciate it. I appreciate you coming on and doing this presentation and taking the time out of your busy schedule. I did some reading on the internet, and I'm like, how do you have any time to do any of this with the stuff that you're involved in? I was just blown away by all your stuff. But kudos to you. Great job. Excellent job.
well, thank you. I appreciate it.
This is not a question. I would just like to say thank you, Mr. Busch, for your time, your knowledge, and sharing it with us.
Well, I appreciate that, Pete. Thank you for the kind words. How many people did we have signing in tonight, out of curiosity?
65.
Oh, wow. Nice turnout.
Which, and again, I mean, that's still, I think, our largest turnout that we've had. And we've been doing this for what, about a year and a half, 2 years now?
Yep.
Well,
that's our largest.
That's great. Ask me back next year.
Oh,
Okay.
absolutely. I'll work on questions.
We'll talk about something else.
All right.
Mike, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. I actually, my Cirrus SR22 G6 is in annual right now, and I got an email today, and it basically says they're almost done with all the items. There's a lot of them. They're waiting for the center hinge.
Did you authorize them all? That's what I want to know.
No, I did not. So
okay, this is a problem.
Yeah, and as I'm listening to this, well, two questions. This was advertised.
Is it still under warranty? That's the other question.
Yeah, it is for many of the items. So, that might be part of it here. But
well, when it comes off of warranty, it's going to be a come to Jesus moment for you. So, I strongly recommend that you get in the habit when you put your airplane in the shop of being very explicit with the shop and saying, I am authorizing you to perform the inspection, but I am not authorizing you to perform any repairs or order any parts until you have prepared a detailed discrepancy list with proposed repair actions and a written estimate for each one that I can go through, and then have a conversation with you about what items I'm prepared to approve.
I suspect this issue is a time-based item. So since I've been on this webinar, I've sent them an email to ask them that very question. And unfortunately, it's only one item. This was also advertised as that it was going to be about high altitude operations. And are you going to do a webinar on that, or? Don't get me wrong, I learned a ton tonight, so I really appreciate
what was the question about high altitude operation?
It was what this webinar was supposed to be about, according to the fact.
Yeah, this is Mike Busch. That's my error. In order to get the wings credit and getting information from our membership about what they wanted to have Mike talk about, there was a disconnect between Mike and myself, and I submitted to for the wings credit the things that our membership were looking at, and as soon as I hit the go button, Mike sent me the topic, and I was like, oh dang, I screwed up. So that's on me. That's on me, sir.
Okay. I was wondering if that's going to happen. I've been flying a TBM for about 10 years, and then I got this airplane for shorter hauls, and just, it's been going great. I got about 150 hours on it since December. But you know, you can always learn something. So when I saw that content, I thought, oh, I'm gonna dial into that too. So, but whatever
This is an SR22T?
yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
It's a,
if you have any specific questions,
Yeah.
you know, feel free to drop me an email,
sure.
or you know,
I've been taking,
you can get on the
screenshots.
podcast if you want to as well, whatever you'd like to do. But I'm always happy to answer your questions.
Perfect.
And if
Thanks.
we're talking about high altitude operations, that's probably of limited interest to a group this size.
Yeah, good point.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Of course.
It's great. Wonderful.
If I may butt in for a second, Mike, do you know of an outfit out of Evanston, Wyoming called KNR Inc.?
KNR.
Kerry
No.
McIntyre runs the shop.
I used to know KRN, but they got bought up. I don't know
No,
KNR.
KNR, he jokes that it means Kerry's not retiring.
I like that.
He's a movie mechanic.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it.
All right, thanks.
Mike, I live in Alpine, Wyoming, and I'm always thinking about maintenance problems if I'm up there because there's not much around. There's a shop in Cody.
Mm-hmm.
You know anything about them from a quality standpoint? Or
I don't from memory. I would have to look it up. We maintain a very large database of maintenance shops around the country, and we kind of color code them with our feelings about the shop if we've had experience with them. But I don't know anything from just from memory. I'd have to actually go look it up.
Yeah, I was just curious. That's not who's doing the annual. It's being done down here in Arizona. So I'm just curious about those guys.
Nothing I can say that I would allow you to record. I've had some dealings with them. I live in Cody.
Oh, you live in Cody? Yeah.
I live in Cody. Yeah.
I think the two of you are going to have to take this offline and have a frank discussion.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to commit libel on a in this forum, right? I don't blame him.
60 people listening in.
Cool. Well, Mikey, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess.
Well, I'm not sure which
Or Mike, sorry.
Oh, the
Who's
other
Mike?
Mike.
Sorry.
Yes, Mike. Please wrap it up.
All right. Very good. I want to thank everybody out there who came onto our webinar tonight, and I really want to thank Mike Busch once again. It was really, it was one of those things. I read your articles and stuff, and I'm like, I'm gonna reach out to him, but he's probably too busy. But no, I really appreciate you getting back to us and agreeing to come on. It's fantastic, and we'll do it again. We'll definitely do it again.
Okay. Well, next time I change computers, I'm gonna leave myself more than 15 minutes of lead time.
I was scrambling tonight too because my iPad wasn't working very well.
Oh, I thought you guys were probably sitting here saying, "Why that rotten SOB didn't show up?"
No, that was very good.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You bet.